A lab. Every animal inside is dead. No bite marks, no sign of disease. The food bins are still full. The water is still running. If a veterinarian had walked in that day, there would have been almost nothing to write in the report. No wounds, no virus, no poison. So what killed them? This was Universe 25. It began with just 8 mice. Less than 5 years later, every one of them was gone, and the answer had almost nothing to do with their bodies. The man behind the experiment was a scientist named John Calhoun. He wasn't studying disease, food, or temperature. He was trying to answer a much harder question. What happens to a society when every problem of survival has already been solved? No predators, no winter, no hunger, no struggle to stay alive. If comfort alone could create a perfect world, this experiment should have proved it. By the time Universe 25 began, Calhoun had already spent years running smaller versions of the same idea. But this was his most ambitious attempt, the experiment designed to settle the question once and for all. The setup was almost disappointingly simple. The food never ran out. The water never stopped flowing. Fresh nesting material was always available. The temperature never changed. On paper, the enclosure had enough space and resources to support thousands of mice without ever running out of what they needed. Then the first 8 mice were placed inside. The doors were sealed. Nothing came in. Nothing went out. For a while, everything unfolded exactly as expected. The mice paired off. The first litters were born. Then more followed. The population doubled. Then doubled again. From the outside, Universe 25 looked like a remarkable success. But Calhoun wasn't just counting how many mice were alive. He was watching how they lived. And beneath the steady population growth, something almost invisible had already begun to change. For a long time, nothing dramatic happened. There was no outbreak, no sudden disaster, no single day you could point to and say, "That's when everything changed." Instead, the cracks appeared quietly, small enough to ignore at first. But once they appeared, they never stopped spreading. The first changes showed up among the young males. In a healthy colony, young males eventually leave the territory where they were born. They explore, compete, and earn a place of their own. That never happened in Universe 25. Every desirable territory was already occupied. There was nowhere meaningful left to go. So instead of building new lives, many of the young males drifted toward the center of the enclosure. They gathered there in growing numbers, not fighting for territory, not looking for mates, barely reacting when other mice challenged them. It wasn't because they were injured. It wasn't because they were sick. It was as if the instinct to even try had quietly switched off. On the edges of the colony, something very different was happening. Some males didn't withdraw. They became relentlessly aggressive, but this wasn't the kind of aggression seen in the wild. Normally, a fight has a purpose: to defend a nest, to protect young, to hold territory. Here, those rules were breaking down. Mice attacked nests they had no interest in claiming. They chased and fought without gaining anything. The social signals that had once kept the colony organized were slowly losing their meaning. The females paid the price. Raising young in a colony this unstable became harder with every generation. Some nests were abandoned, some newborns were left without care, others simply didn't survive. And with every failed generation, something more important was disappearing. Young mice weren't just losing parents. They were losing the behaviors they were supposed to learn from them. Each generation inherited a little less of the social world that had once held the colony together. Then, in the middle of all that disorder, Calhoun noticed a group of mice that looked almost untouched by the chaos. At first glance, they seemed like the success story, the survivors, the ones who had adapted. He would eventually give them a name that people still remember today: the beautiful ones. They stood out immediately. Their fur was perfectly clean. Their bodies carried no scars. They looked healthy, well-fed, untouched by the violence spreading through the enclosure. For a moment, they seemed to prove that some mice had found a way to thrive. But the longer Calhoun watched them, the stranger they became. They never fought for territory. They never courted mates. They never raised young. They rarely interacted with other mice at all. Their lives settled into the same quiet routine: eat, sleep, groom, repeat. At first, they looked like the healthiest mice in the colony. In reality, they weren't escaping the collapse. They had simply stepped outside it. They were still alive, but they were no longer participating in the social life of their own species. And they weren't just a small, unusual group. As the colony grew older, more and more mice began behaving the same way. Without injury, without disease, without starvation. The collapse wasn't spreading through their bodies. It was spreading through their behavior. For a while, the population kept growing. Then, almost without warning, the growth slowed. Then it stopped. Nothing had changed physically. The food was still there. The water was still flowing. The enclosure was exactly as it had always been, but fewer pups were being born. Fewer adults were pairing off. Pregnancies became less common. Then rarer still. Eventually, there was a final litter. And after that, nothing. There was no mass die-off, no single catastrophe, no dramatic ending. Just an aging population that grew smaller, generation after generation, until there was no next generation left. If you had walked into Universe 25 at the end, you wouldn't have found a colony destroyed by starvation or disease. You would have found a society that had quietly stopped replacing itself. For decades, most people believed they already understood why. The lesson seemed obvious. Give a society everything it wants, and comfort will eventually destroy it. It was a simple explanation. Easy to remember, easy to repeat. It also wasn't what John Calhoun actually concluded. When you read his own papers, comfort isn't the villain. Something else failed first, and it failed long before the last mouse died. Calhoun believed there were two deaths. The second is the one everyone remembers. The colony ages, the population shrinks. Eventually, the last mouse dies. But he argued that the first death came much earlier. A social death. Not something you could see in an X-ray or diagnose in a laboratory. A slow collapse of the roles that once held the colony together. Young males no longer had territory to earn. Parents could no longer pass stable social patterns to the next generation. With each generation, the colony inherited a little less structure than the one before. The bodies survived. The society didn't. That's why the beautiful ones mattered so much. They weren't the cause of the collapse. They were the evidence that it had already happened. They were healthy, safe, well-fed, and yet they had almost no role left to play. That was the colony's first death. The second one simply took longer to arrive. Most retellings end the story there, as a warning that comfort inevitably destroys civilizations. Calhoun didn't see it that way. To him, the experiment wasn't a prophecy. It was a question. And questions only matter if they leave room for an answer. For the rest of his career, Calhoun became interested in something very different. Not how societies collapse, but how they continue creating new roles as they grow. He believed human beings possessed something the mice never could, the ability to invent new forms of purpose when old ones disappear. New responsibilities. New communities. New problems worth solving. Later, he gave that idea a name, ideational generativity. It's not a memorable phrase, but the idea behind it changes the meaning of the entire experiment. Universe 25 was never simply asking whether abundance is dangerous. It was asking something much more difficult. What happens when a society keeps solving its material problems, but stops creating meaningful reasons for its members to matter? Maybe that's why people are still talking about 8 mice more than 50 years later. Not because the experiment predicts our future, but because it forces us to think about a question the mice never had the chance to answer. When every physical need has been met, what is left to strive for? The enclosure never ran out of food. It never ran out of water. What it ran out of was participation. Calhoun believed the mice never had a choice. We do. Maybe that's why the experiment never really ended. Maybe it simply changed subjects. If this changed how you think about comfort, purpose, and the roles we play, hit subscribe. The next story goes even deeper into the experiments that reveal what humans are really built for.